despite our arguments about God, proved to be the sustaining institution for people facing death, the black church. So this was the first subject, because you couldn't really have a political program if it wasn't consistent with your sense of what was possible given human nature. So that was a long discussion, and we rejected both optimism and pessimism, but you know, I think we felt that the future was open, but that nothing was a given. There was nothing inherent that would stop us, but there was no guarantee. And that was a break from the concept of a dialectic in which there are antagonists who resolve their antagonism and move forward to a higher plane. Both Marxism and certain forms of Catholicism operate, and Christianity operate on a dialectical model that we broke with. The second point was that given this philosophy, we thought that participatory democracy was the central, the common ground for our project. The phrase came to us from Arnold Kaufman, late departed, who was a philosophy professor or political scientist in Ann Arbor. And he had passed it along from John Dewey, who, by the way, had been the chairman of the board of the League for Industrial Democracy, which was the parent organization of the SDS.
Student League for Industrial Democracy,
yeah,
and then in turn
became SDS. So Dewey's philosophy, simplified, was learning by doing. And participatory democracy meant that all power should be placed in the hands at the most local level. That people had a right to decisions that would affect their lives. That this was a practical matter if you were facing the draft, for example, and knew that you couldn't vote. But it also was embodied in the very moving stand that Southern students, mainly black, were taking, essentially throwing their future careers away, or throwing them to the wind, rejecting their parents' terms of engagement, and integrating lunch counters, buses, and going to jail and being beaten, and in some instances killed, and in many instances hurt, thrown out of school. This was an amazing example of courage, which we then immediately associated with not simply direct action, but it was the coming of a participatory social order. And again, it was very practical. If you're asking people to go to jail and perhaps die in the afternoon, they have a natural tendency to want to participate in the decision. So these were people who were willing to die, but only on their own terms. And so you got this consensus process as opposed to a majority-minority decision-making process where, if at all possible, you didn't go to an action unless everybody had agreed. And no matter what it took, 12 hours of discussion, overnight, long hours, the agreement was seen as a moral obligation to strive for, to achieve. And so out of these small human steps arose this concept of participatory democracy that could be achieved through our own movement, which was based on these fundamental precepts. And we never imagined the internet and what potential that would have for magnifying communication or participation. We didn't really think very much of institutional reforms, you know, like taking away the right of corporations to personhood, or the reform of the initiative procedure so that things could go on the ballot. I think that it was more a movement concept than an institutional concept. But the movement concept was supposed to shape all of the institutions so that everyone in their school or workplace or in the armed forces would have greater decision-making power instead of just taking orders. That was the concept. And I think that that has spread around the world to this day, and in surprising ways, because I think it must stem from a need in human nature that we perceived. It doesn't arrive with manifestos. It doesn't arrive with speeches. It arises from within people when they have suffered a moral injury to a soul or a dignity that they may not even have known that they had. But you can only push people so far, as the old saying goes. And what does it mean? It means that if you push people far enough, at some point, someday, they will fight back. They will resist, because you have touched a realm of human nature that people may not even be aware that they have. We can call it dignity or soul. So it's a very deep concept, and I have great faith that nothing can overcome it. And it recurs in surprising ways. So that was I think, the lasting idea. There was a practical application of this that we attempted, and maybe we were too utopian, but the idea was that you could combine the student movement with other movements, and the students would be like a catalytic force that would wake up other movements and realign the Democratic Party, the two-party system, the institutions, and the country in a progressive direction, starting with the issues of race, poverty, and student empowerment. And in that sense, the Port Huron Statement has some interesting strategic lessons. It said that the university, far from being a marginal, irrelevant institution on the sidelines, was everywhere, was larger than ever before, with millions of people enrolled, and that we were entering into an information age, a symbolic information age in which knowledge workers, students and faculty would be more important, more central to the future than ever before, and that social change would be based on convincing people, not just on how many hungry people there were in the country, because it was now a requirement of the middle class to be involved in radical social movements more than just the smaller industrial working class or the poor. Even though we were aligned with the poor, we knew that we had to wake people up. So the idea was to realign the Democratic Party by forcing a showdown in the South and getting rid of the segregationist Dixiecrats who dominated the party, based on the arrangement made back in the 30s by Roosevelt and the Democrats, that they would get the New Deal on the one hand, but the price paid would be peace with segregation and Jim Crow in the South. Blacks would be left out of Social Security, and so on. Talk about tough compromises. Keep that in mind when you venerate Roosevelt as the model for Madison and the future. So we did accomplish that through direct action and through international pressure and through awakening the Northern conscience, the Northern liberal conscience. And that produced a Democratic Party that in turn produced Clinton, Gore, Jimmy Carter, any number of people who were way more radical than the segregationists, but we would think of today as kind of center liberal politicians. But that didn't solve any of the problems. It didn't solve the problem of Vietnam or the wars, didn't solve the problem of poverty. It brought on greater new forms of corporate and financial capital in the economy. At its worst, it brought about a kind of pro-corporate liberalism. Pro-corporate on the one hand, and more tolerant of diversity and acknowledging of equal rights to vote and so on the social side. So we failed there, but it was a step that I think was inevitable. It had to happen because we were fighting for the overthrow of the old order in the South. We had to win the North. The result of the winning was that we got the rest of the North, not simply the Northerners who were sympathetic to ending segregation in the South. So that's a lesson I learned about stages where, you know, despite your vision and best laid plans, you achieve great things, but at the same time there's an inevitable compromise and you move on. The last thing I want to say, though, that pertains to this is that I think that we might have succeeded in building a movement based on the students in the South and on the civil rights movement, the farm workers, and the peace liberals and so on, and even labor, that would have elected a president and a coalition that was far more progressive than anything that we've seen since the New Deal. And that's to say that Port Huron was meant to be a winning strategy. That was the sharpest break, perhaps, from most of the left. The concept of winning, the concept of succeeding. Many in the left came out of a morbid immigrant past where life was very hazardous and the hope for redemption very dim, a losing mentality. I didn't share that, and most of us were, as I said, kind of bratty and thought that we were the best and the brightest. And so when we planned to do something, we planned to succeed. So I think that it would have succeeded except for assassination, murder most foul. And I hate to end on this note, but I think that it's something that we all need to be aware of now and in the future. Most political theory, left, right, and center, is based on an analysis of various factors that lead to institutional change, but they inevitably leave out murder most foul, as Shakespeare would have put it. I think that the assassination of leaders, was the dominant factor that determined the outcome of the 1960s. And I'm not dwelling on whether any of the various conspiracy theories are true or whether there's something in the culture that manifests as violence against progressive leaders when change becomes too threatening. But to lose John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, all in a period of less than 5 years, basically decapitated a movement that was already unstable enough, that was already difficult to direct and channel. And it deprived us of being what we might have become. We instead became might-have-beens. And so that's where the story ended for me, and I fear the same cycle of hope and the dashing of hope and the raising of violence today as I look around this country, left, right, and center. And I think that's why the Port Huron experience, rather than the words of the statement, the Port Huron experience of huge idealism dashed is also worth examination, not simply the statements in the document itself. There are going to be conferences on Port Huron this year. We need an organizer. We don't have, there's no we, they're just happening. There's one at NYU, Robbie Cohn, who wrote a wonderful book on Mario Savio. They are concentrating on what's teachable from Port Huron, and there's a network of high school students and teachers who are involved in that. That's a very promising initiative. A second one at UC Santa Barbara, Dick Flax, who was a co-author of the document, and Nelson Lichtenstein, the labor historian, are putting together another one with a lot of panels that I think is going to be very good for archives. It's an attempt to look back from many, many dimensions at what it was about and what happened and what are the lessons. There may be one in Ann Arbor, I don't know. There may be one in Madison.
We're here destined to be one in Madison.
We're here to discuss one in Madison. The reason I love the idea of Madison is because it seems to me the Port Huron vision became manifest in Wisconsin during this year, and such a uprising deserves much more consideration, because everything said in the Port Huron statement came about unexpectedly in Wisconsin.
What date
So,
did that happen? What day? When you said it happened in Wisconsin, what day? Like, what month?
What are you talking about?
What will?
You said it happened this year, I was just wondering.
Oh, no.
I mean, a long time ago, but
February through May would
February,
be a high
okay, that's
point.
what.
You mean this year in Madison? I don't know what you mean.
You just referred to an anniversary, I just wondered when the original date was. Because
Oh,
you're
the
saying
Port
it's
Huron
an
statement?
anniversary year.
Port Huron statement,
June 62.
June 62. Oh, so 2012 would be the big anniversary.
Yeah,
you could say so.
yeah, that's
We
why
will
we're
say
calling
so.
this the 50th anniversary of Port Huron.
Well, that
Okay,
sounds
so
like-
any other questions?
Let me make a few Wisconsinite comments, and then I think I'll handle the questions. For those of you who live in the Madison area or come back from time to time, there will indeed be in the first week of May 2012 a 5-day conference on the 50th or so anniversaries of SNCC and SDS and their meanings for today's movement. And when this session ends, I think 10:30, Tom will be staying, I'll be here, and other people on the planning committee who met over several months now will all be here, and those who are interested will stay, and by all means, let's talk about this upcoming conference. It may be the biggest of them all, or just the longest in terms of days, or something else. At any rate, it'll be in Madison for good reasons, we think. Two more Madison notes before we turn to questions. The first one is, one of the most recurrent signs, for those of you who weren't here February to May, was what would Bob do? We saw it everywhere. It was even more frequent than general strike. And of course, most people will know that's a reference to Robert LaFollette, the great governor of Wisconsin, the most important political person in the history of Wisconsin. And it was terribly important, it remains terribly important, not only because LaFollette believed in clean government in a time of vast corruption and political patronage, which now has returned and wiped out almost all the reforms that have happened since the 1910s, but also because La Follette's vision and his run for the presidency in 1924, in which he carried Wisconsin, albeit no other states, and died an early death in his own way from exhaustion shortly after, was based upon opposition to American empire. Thoroughgoing reform, democratization at the local level, defying monopolies' attempts to take over local politics, the power of the bank in Wisconsin and other places and so forth, returning power to local working people, farmers, and small merchants. That was the La Follette program, but it also included opposition to American empire. An easy position by the 1920s when disillusionment with the First World War was massive. A more difficult proposition after the 1930s because of the threat of fascism. But for Tom Hayden, whose parents are from Wisconsin, as we must note, the burden of political memory must never exclude that opposition to empire, which historically was as Republican as Democratic, as right-wing in a way as it was left-wing, but definitely, like a group I'm in today, transcends all those political lines and has its own unique importance, like the oddball Ron Paul raising the peace message within the otherwise pro-war Republican camp. So, at any rate, what the tradition of Wisconsin combining demands for domestic reforms and local activities with local participation with an opposition to empire, that brings us all the way back to the 1960s and the great difficulty of the social movements of the 1960s, especially beyond the moment when the draft threatened to take away so many college students and therefore precipitated a vast opposition to the war. That's about all that I want to add. So by all means, now let's take some questions and comments. Yes?
Yeah,